Okay, I think we should be able to start. Charles, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Marta. Distinguished participants, colleagues, and friends. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to today's webinar. I am delighted to introduce our guest, Dame Diane Coyle, Bennett Professor of Public Policy at the University of Cambridge, and author of several important works, most recently her book, The Measure of Progress, Counting What Really Matters. It is a great honor to have Professor here with us at the United Nations at a time when our member states look to the deadline of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and start to think about lessons learned from the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. Just a few months ago, world leaders gathered in Doha, Qatar for the Second World Summit for Social Development, where they adopted the Doha Political Declaration and reaffirmed their commitment to placing people at the center of development. The declaration explicitly recognized the need to develop frameworks that complement or go beyond GDP, echoing growing consensus that our metrics must better reflect what our societies really value. We also recognize that the world has changed dramatically, even since Doha and more so since Copenhagen. These changes will impact social development. However, the momentum from the Doha summit is central to our work here at DESA. As we begin early thinking on the World Social Report for 2027, we are exploring how an equity lens might help shape more effective policies, asking not just whether economies are growing, but who benefits, who is left behind, and what are we building for future generations. Professor Coyle's work speaks directly to these questions. So please join me in welcoming her, and I now hand over to my colleague Marta Roig, who will moderate the session. Thank you, all the best, and over to you, Marta.
Thanks very much, Charles. To your introduction, I would only add that Diane has been a crucial voice in rethinking how we measure economic progress and more broadly, what economic progress means, and that she has been writing about the digital revolution for over 30 years, if I'm not mistaken. So welcome everybody, and Diane will speak for about 25 minutes, I believe, and then we will open the floor for questions. I would encourage you to post your questions in the Q&A box, please, not the chat box, but the Q&A box as Diane speaks or at the end of her presentation. And so then we'll open the discussion with your questions. Thanks so much. Diane, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Charles and Marta, for that very kind introduction. I'm going to ask our colleague Julie to start sharing the slides. Thank you for that, Julie. It's a great honor to be invited to take part in this webinar today. And it is, as Charles was saying, a very important time for thinking about how do we measure what's happening in the economy and are people's standards of living getting better or not. We often think about this agenda in terms of what's happening to the environment and environmental sustainability, which is, of course, a really important lens, and I will circle back to that right at the end of my comments. But I want to focus more on how the structure of the economy is changing and some of the social dimensions that we should be thinking about now, not least because, although, as Marta alluded to, we've had digital change for some 3 decades or so now, this is accelerating with generative AI and all of the changes that's bringing about in many economies. So, Julie, if we can go to the next slide, please. What is it now, 12 years ago, I wrote a book about GDP. It was a little history of the measure that we use to think about how the economy is progressing. One of the basic points of the book is that the construct of GDP dated from the exact circumstances of the Second World War, because the imperative was for governments to understand what resources were available for their war machines and what was left for consumption. And so it was a macroeconomic framework built in particular circumstances and then extended through the United Nations framework in the decades after the Second World War. That's now a very long time ago, and the economy has changed substantially. So if we can move on one slide, please. My another one, my most recent book, The Measure of Progress, poses the question, what do we need to know today? What would a new kind of framework for understanding living standards and progress look like now? And so one of the points is that even though the digital revolution is now several decades old, there are big gaps in our measurement of what is going on in the digital economy. One aspect of this, and one that's very much in the news now, is what's happening with global supply chains. In the pandemic to start with, or even before that in the financial crisis, and with environmental disasters, we started to understand that global supply chains had points of fragility that were not well known, and that the whole process of globalization had had consequences that were not particularly well understood. But that's only one aspect of how the structure of production changed. There are some very unlovely terms in economics for what's been happening. One is servitization, the idea that manufacturing is increasingly accompanied by services, and companies offer bundles of services around the manufacturing. And the higher value the manufacturing, the more likely that is to be the case. Factoryless goods producers are the kinds of producers who don't actually manufacture anything themselves. They do the design, they will do the marketing and customer relationships, but the manufacture takes place in the middle and is outsourced or offshored. And then in addition, there are a number of other consequences of digitization. And one of those is free. Free goods don't fit very easily into the national accounts framework, and yet they create tremendous economic value. Open source software is one example. The whole internet sits on a bedrock of open source software, and increasingly there are other types that are available for free. Free search, highly valued by consumers who can access it. So how do we think about free production and free consumption? It's a well-known problem that it's very hard to understand what happens to price indices and therefore the real volume of output and productivity when there are new goods or there's dramatic technical change. And there's a distributional aspect to this as well. The kinds of price indices that national accountants use assume that goods are substitutes for each other, but you can't substitute your online social media for food. And so the energy shock and the food price shocks have an impact on inflation that isn't fully reflected in the aggregate statistics. And then increasingly with AI data, the value of data, and for training the AI models, for cementing the market power of big tech companies, but also the way that data and analyzing data can be used to improve understanding of consumer preferences and consumer needs to deliver goods and services of higher value. On top of that, there are other issues less well debated. AI increasingly, and the idea of what's been termed a job apocalypse. Is AI going to destroy lots of existing white-collar jobs? Much in the news recently. The production boundary, the boundary between what's marketed in the economy and counted in GDP and what isn't. It's always been an artifact, and in the informal economy obviously lies on the wrong side of the production boundary very often, the work that people do in the home, household production. But digital capabilities mean that activities are increasingly substituting across that boundary and making it hard to interpret the figures. Time use and the relationship between how people use their time and not just their monetary income, but their well-being. And also then broadly national wealth, so having a broader understanding of national wealth. So I'm just going to focus in on some of these in the remainder of my time today. So if we could go on to the next slide, please. Changes in technology are always highly disruptive, and that's for good and ill. So the illustration here is the Industrial Revolution, of course, the introduction of cotton looms and weaving, and all of the other industries that we think of as characterizing that period in the 19th century, steam and rail and later electricity in the 20th century. And there were two types of outcomes. One was the creation, ultimately, of a prospering middle class able to enjoy their leisure, as you see in this photograph on the right of this slide, but also the tremendous inequality and the growth of the Victorian slums that novelists like Charles Dickens and George Eliot wrote about. And so the challenge at the moment, I think, facing another new general purpose technology in AI, is how do we make sure that it enables broad prosperity and improvements in people's living standards for the masses, rather than the kind of immiserization that we saw during part of the 19th century. That's the policy challenge as well as the measurement challenge. And so let's think harder about unpaid production and household production. If we can go on to the next slide. I already gave a few examples of unpaid production: open source software, highly valuable, user innovation, often in sporting goods or in medical devices, where these start out as small markets and innovators use online and features like digital printing to create items of value such as prosthetic limbs or new sporting goods, and these sometimes later get commercialized and sometimes not. Household production, the way that we increasingly do, for example, our own online banking or own online booking of travel. And all of these are examples of valuable activities shifting from one side of the production boundary to another. And you can see this in the market economy as well, which is what the images here illustrate. The top left-hand one is grocery shopping in a country like the UK in the 1950s and 1960s, where the housewife, as it typically was, who was not at work, had ample time to go to the grocery store and ask for the products that were kept behind the counter and chat to the grocer who was selling them to her. Supermarkets were then the next innovation, a kind of process innovation. And so here you've got an image of early checkouts and the people who would help shoppers put their groceries into bags after they had been passed through the checkout. The next step in this was that you put your own groceries into bags, and the checkouts were automated and linked to the logistics systems and the data collection systems of the supermarkets. And now in countries like the US and UK, we're increasingly using these automatic machines to do our own scanning and our own bagging of the groceries. And so what's happened here is a steady substitution with increasing amounts of capital and software and decreasing amounts of paid labour, which is partly substituted by our unpaid labour. So it's one example of why it's hard to interpret the conventional GDP figures, because this shift will show an increase in the productivity of the supermarkets, which is partly, if you like, genuine because of capital deepening the use of software and machines, but also partly not a labour productivity increase because we've substituted some unpaid labour in there. And this question about should more of this labour be paid has come to be known in the literature as the time tax, that we spend a lot of time online doing things now that are unpaid, that previously used to be somebody's job and paid for labour. And also this concept of data as labour, that we are producing through our activities online a lot of very valuable data that's being used by a small number of companies to improve their profits and productivity. If we go on to the next slide, another kind of example of structural shifts are the changing business models that companies are using. And so some of the images here are well-known factoryless goods producers. As I mentioned, Apple doesn't itself manufacture iPhones, it contracts that out. The value it creates is in the software. But also it is a hardware company because these devices are at the heart of its business model. Arm designs chips, but again, doesn't manufacture. Mercedes manufactures some of its vehicles, but not this particular kind. That's contracted out manufacturing. And Rolls-Royce does indeed make these fantastic aero engines, but it makes more than half its profits and revenues from the services and the maintenance it sells around the engines. I might have added platform business models, which are a business model innovation. And there, again, the distribution of value along the production chain has shifted. It started out being fantastic for consumers and suppliers to the platforms because they had these new convenient intermediaries that expanded markets and allowed a much wider range of preferences to be satisfied. But over time, increasingly the value has come to be captured by the platforms themselves and their relatively small number of employees. With all of the shifts that we've seen in many economies from smaller retailers, some smaller physical retailers, towards the large companies that can support platform logistics. So a lot of structural changes with corresponding shifts in the distribution of the increased value that's been enabled by these new production models. So if we can go on to the next slide, this is getting worse because of AI. This is something that my colleague John and I have recently written a paper about. The question being, what do we need to know to understand quickly enough for policymakers to respond how AI is transforming the economy? And this potential transformation is significant. Although there's a lot of hype about AI and artificial general intelligence, I do believe it's a significant technology that will spread throughout the economy. And these are some of the things, some of the consequences that will occur. The quality of services will be improved, but the nature of many people's jobs will change. The composition of the tasks that make up a job could change quite dramatically, and to some extent we're starting to see that. As in any structural shift in the economy, some jobs will be lost and others gained, so there'll be that sort of churn. People's allocation of time, how they spend their time at work and in leisure, will continue to change. And there might well be new business models, including through AI agents, which is where the technological effort is now being focused. But the point here is that this is a transformation one cannot see in the data at the moment and isn't easy to track currently through official statistics. And this is happening pretty quickly. If you go on to the next slide, please, Julie. The chart on the right is well-known metric showing the length of tasks that AI can now perform with a given success rate. And you'll see that this has gone from a few seconds in 2020 through to 4 hours now, probably longer than this. And so the capability of the models is increasing quite dramatically. There is hype. There may well be a financial bubble. But so far, the scaling laws, as they're referred to, adding more computer power, larger models, more training data, has enabled these quite dramatic advances in the capabilities of the models. And the competition among US companies and also Chinese companies is encouraging that technological shift to continue very rapidly. So what does this imply? If we could go on to the next slide, please. One of the things it implies is churn in the job market. And so the social consequences could be quite significant. And here are some examples from Davos recently of a range of people talking about their concerns about what Kristalina Georgieva referred to as the tsunami of job losses from AI. So real concern about this, and not a lot of consensus about how policymakers might address it. I do think at the moment these fears are overdone. If we can go on to the next slide. At the moment, the use of AI by companies is quite limited. These are relatively recent UK figures, and so the number of firms is about 8% stating that they use AI. In the US, which is probably the most advanced in terms of adoption, you find figures from surveys in the low teens in the proportion of firms using AI. It's very prominent because the tech sector uses it a lot, and a lot is written about that. Usage is also correlated with GDP per capita, which isn't surprising. But we don't really know, because the data isn't available, what people, what companies are doing with the AI that they're using, what tools are they using. So that's kind of insight from surveys is only just starting to come through. For the tech sector, it's clearly coding. Outside the tech sector, it's often writing tasks such as writing marketing materials. So this is not insignificant, but it's still quite limited, and the range of jobs being affected is therefore still quite limited. And the reason is that there are some significant frictions in adopting AI, like any other technology. So if we go on more slide, this busy chart just makes the point that there are a lot of costs involved in adopting a new technology, and that's why the change is slow. The left-hand side is technical costs, such as licensing or updating models through continually improving access to data. The right-hand side is organizational change, which is probably much more significant. If we go on one more slide, there are many reasons why organizations are slow to change. Finance directors are focused on cost saving, operational efficiencies, not strategic concerns. It's easier to make incremental innovations using AI. Some part of the company might want to use it, but not others. And so you need to get consensus across silos within the organization. Boards don't understand the technology, and so on. So a lot of reasons, in fact, why there are organizational frictions in the use of AI, which is bad news in terms of productivity gains and the hopes for that, but better news in terms of the potential for disruption in the job market. Might give us more time to adjust to what's going on. If we go on one more slide, there are also other broader reasons why change can be slow. The image here is from a paper looking at the costs of restructuring companies in a number of European countries and the US and UK as well. And you can see that in the middle, Denmark and Switzerland have low business restructuring costs. US restructuring costs are not surprisingly quite low, not surprisingly quite low as well. But in some other countries, the costs of restructuring mean that it's much harder for less productive companies to exit the market and more productive companies to get into the market. It's also complicated to adopt AI and to use data. Companies need to redo their data architecture to make advantage. And then some broader business environment issues like the availability of capital, the presence of the right kind of infrastructure, and the policy coordination in the institutional environment. Is the business environment conducive to the kinds of change that will drive productivity growth over the long term? If we go on to the next slide, these actually can be incredibly significant barriers. This is an illustration of a well-known paper by the economic historian Paul David, who argued that the reason it took electricity 50 years to have a transformational effect on the economy was that factories built around steam engines, like the ones on the left, were tall because the engines were expensive and they drove all of the machines around a central shaft. When you introduce electricity and dynamos, it was possible to have an engine per machine and introduce the assembly line, but that needed flat factories with a lot of space. And so rather than city centre tall mills, you ended up with low, spread out factories in the suburbs. And so that's a significant shift in the infrastructure needs and the physical capital needs to adopt the new technology. If we go on to the next slide, productivity is driven largely by process innovations. These are examples through history of the kinds of innovations that have led to significant gains in productivity and therefore in living standards over time. So to pick, for example, just-in-time manufacturing in the 1990s was a source of quite dramatic improvements in productivity in manufacturing, particularly in the auto industry, but more broadly. The tasks involved in making a car didn't change, but the way that was put together, the end-to-end processes, changed substantially. And that's the kind of process phenomenon that we'll be looking for now if AI is going to drive productivity growth in our economies. If we can go on, I think, skip the next slide and go on to two. One of the things that I think is really interesting is what is AI going to do to the character of people's jobs? If you think about automation in manufacturing, although it was disruptive and led to deindustrialization and all the social consequences that we've seen, there were also positive aspects to that in terms of the quality of jobs. Jobs in manufacturing now are fewer, but they're higher paid, and they don't have the noise and stress and industrial injuries of the kind of factories that my parents and aunts and uncles worked in the 1960s. So AI similarly has potential to free people from some dull work. It might replace some expert tasks as well. And recently, digital has increasingly automated more expert tasks rather than routine ones. And the nature of the tasks involved in jobs is going to evolve quite substantially. So we need to understand what's happening to levels of employment, wage distribution, and where it's happening, because I think one of the lessons of the 90s is that the policy responses were inadequate to that wave of automation. So even if AI does no more than something similar to automation in the 1990s in manufacturing, it could have quite devastating social consequences. If it's concentrated geographically, if the people affected are not given the flexibility and skills to enable them to change the way they earn their living. And so it is something that policymakers need to start thinking about now. If we can go on to the next one, we can also think about the benefits of AI at home. So here's a demonstration domestic robot. I think we'd all love it if we got the AI equivalent of the washing machine to take away some of the domestic tasks that we don't like. There's great potential for elderly care, and many countries in the world now have aging populations. But it makes me wonder, should we start thinking about household productivity, and how do we ensure that the direction of innovation in AI takes account of the household sector as well as what's going on in the conventional business sector? I'm aware of time and I've got far too many slides, so I think I will now ask you, Julie, to go on to two more slides. So I've been talking about digital, obviously. It's my research area at the moment. It's a significant technology and it'll bring about dramatic changes. But I promise to circle back to the environmental dimension of this. And so I would make the case for the comprehensive wealth approach, thinking about what are the assets available in the economy, broadly understood, because that's what's available to people to lead the kind of lives that they want to lead. And you could think about this in conventional economic terms or in terms of capabilities. Without a wide range of assets available, people will be limited in what they can achieve and the progress that they experience in their lives. So measuring all of these assets better is, for me, a big part of the measurement agenda at the moment. Natural capital, we've made a lot of headway with. Human capital, some headway, but it would be good to introduce health there. I think that's one of the key lessons of the pandemic. Intangible assets, I think we have a long way to go in understanding how they're created, how they're valued, and who gains that value. And then I'd also add cultural heritage here as well, partly because it's part of the infrastructure for tourism, which is an important sector in many economies, but also for the intrinsic value that it creates for human lives and well-being. So if we can go on two more slides again. And just to wrap up with thinking about what are the implications of this for measurement and for policy. I do think previous technology transitions have not been handled well in terms of policy. Many of the industrialized economies are characterized by areas, regions where people have not had good quality jobs and the capacity to earn high incomes for 2 generations now because of that 1990s experience. Can we do better now? I think there are definitely lessons to be learned from examples like Denmark's flexicurity or examples of transition from informal to formal work in some other economies, of policies that will help people make those transitions more smoothly than in the past and change the skills that they need. There are obviously generational aspects to this. One of the merits of a comprehensive wealth approach is that it embeds sustainability. Any balance sheet points you towards sustainability. We have not done well by future generations. With both the environment, climate, and AI, there are existential challenges, perhaps. And we're at a phase, I think, where the role of the state is now again being contested. To what extent should governments help people overcome some of the increased risks associated with technology transitions? Are we in a world similar to the pre-1980s world where governments are expected to share more of that risk? And indeed, we see that in all the conversations that are going on about industrial policy. Again, if we can go on 2 more slides. This is what motivates the research that we're doing at the Bennett School in Cambridge. This is the strap line. We want the right kind of growth, we want sustainable growth, and we want it fairly shared. And I think the measurement agenda is key to understanding what's going on in our economies and what policies might enable it to go better for people in general, not just a minority. So I rattled through those, apologies for that, but thank you very much indeed.
Diane, thanks very much to you for this very rich presentation, which clearly shows that how much we still don't know, how much we haven't known for a long time about economic output and how much more we don't know now, because the digital transformation is unfolding in ways that are not visible in current statistical systems, let's say. I find the point about time savings very compelling. The fact that maybe economic progress is not reflected so much in output as it is in time savings. But all of this obviously poses questions that you have already suggested in terms of the distribution of gains, of productivity gains, and on the impacts of work. And I hope part of the discussion will go into that. If trends from the last decade are, if we take them as an example, then productivity gains have not gone to improving the wages of the average worker, and by that I mean 99% of workers, right? So in that sense, time savings and freeing people of dull tasks is good. But if then a 3-day work week translates into 3 days of pay, then all this new revolution will do is increase inequality and income insecurity and so on, and with consequences for the social contract. So maybe the question is obviously how we can measure economic output better, but how can we ensure that this better measurement comes with a better understanding of the gains, who gains and how from these changes as well, right? Two dimensions that I would say are both dimensions of economic progress, because it's not about economic growth alone, but economic progress means more than economic growth. So with that said, I'll open the floor to questions. If you can pose your questions, I think there's some questions in the chat already in the Q&A. And then if there's time, maybe people can ask some questions directly, but let's start with the questions in the Q&A. So here's a question. Diane, should I take a couple of questions and then you answer 2 or 3, or you prefer to go one by one?
Let's do one by one, because otherwise I'll forget what the questions are.
Okay. So if servitization is more profitable for companies, what prevents firms from deliberately lowering product quality to drive more upgrades and maintenance needs? How can we measure the resulting moral hazard and its impact on public welfare and public trust?
That's an interesting question. I think for me, it points to the importance of competitive markets. And particularly at a time when governments are introducing industrial policies again, focusing on particular strengths in their economies, which I do think is the right way to think about structural change, because policy decisions taken now will shape the production capacity of the economy for many years to come.
Mm.
But without the discipline of competition between companies, you get all kinds of perverse effects, including the incentive to reduce quality, particularly for products where it's very hard for the customer to monitor the quality. Now, that does run into a difficulty in many of these contexts of servitization because they are quite concentrated markets, because of very large economies of scale, and because relationships are built up between the supplier and the customer. So I think it's a real risk. But on the other hand, you can argue that to take the example of aero engines, it would be reputationally disastrous for anything to go wrong, and so there's a kind of limit there also. And I suppose I still believe in the importance of human relations in these supply chains. In many of these supply chains do have people who work together very closely to develop product standards and make sure the quality needs are met.
Great. Yeah, thanks so much, Diane. So another question, workers pay income tax. Would the government lose income tax revenue as a result of robots replacing human workers?
There have been suggestions that we should start taxing the robots, of course. The downside being that disincentivizes people to companies to automate. I think this tax question is a really challenging one for governments because the more value creation is intangible, in general, the harder it becomes to tax that value. And I think it's leading economists to think more about, for example, land value tax, taxing buildings, taxing the things that can't move and that are not so mobile and or hard to monitor. The other aspect of this is returning some progressivity into income taxes. It has been politically challenging to do so for some decades now, but it may be that we get to a time when that becomes part of the policy debate also. Even in the United States, in the 1960s, the top marginal rate of income tax was above 90%. And so what political scientists call the Overton window can change quite dramatically over the decades. And I don't think I'd be very surprised if we start returning to a world where we're discussing income taxes on more progressive income taxes again.
Absolutely. Yes, that's true. Let me move on to the first question, but then also I wanted to say about this, that there's where also the issue of the universal basic income comes in, right? And if it were true that we are in an age of abundance, then you could think that work could be replaced by the lack of decent work for everyone could be replaced for some form of universal basic income. But there again, the question is whether work has a value beyond the income it provides, if it has social values that go beyond.
Yes, I'm less keen on universal basic income than some people. I mean, you still have to raise the revenue, so you still have to tax something to fund the universal basic income. If the issue is making welfare systems work better, then of course I'm all in favour of it. But it's a very individualistic framing. And so it raises questions about raising tax revenues to fund infrastructure. You can't buy your own local bus service or your waste collection service with a universal basic income. And so I am more interested in thinking about societal approaches to solving these kinds of issues.
Yeah. Okay, let's move to, there's a lot of questions now, and I'm not sure I'll be able to go through all of them. Let's start with the next one. Modernizing national accounts to better capture intangible assets like data, knowledge, and digital capital seems to, oops, I'm sorry, the questions keep jumping down. Let's see if I can just freeze them. Modernizing national accounts to better capture intangible assets like data, etc., seems to abstract from the gender social relations that produce those assets. How might incorporating a gender lens reshape what counts as intangible capital in the first place?
That's a very interesting question. I haven't thought about it before. I think there are types of intangibles that are probably highly differentiated by gender or other socio-demographic characteristics. Data, for instance, often captures important aspects of people's identity, the kinds of tacit knowledge that companies hold. If the occupations are gendered, that will be gendered also. But it's a very interesting question. I need to think more about that.
Okay. Thank you, Diane. Okay, so let's go to the next one. In your book, you discuss alternatives for measuring progress beyond GDP, including the direct measurement of well-being through life satisfaction metrics. But you know that life satisfaction may be problematic as a policy metric at the aggregate level. Could you elaborate on this? And then this is someone from my team. In our work with Gallup life satisfaction data, we have found that country-level averages and trends haven't been particularly informative. I'm curious whether this aligns with your point about the limitations of aggregate-level measurement, or if there are other concerns.
Yes, they don't shift very quickly. And so as a guide for policy, that makes them quite limited. I mean, of course, well-being is what we care about.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think it's a very agile indicator for policy needs. And it's also because of the way the metric is constructed, I think it's a mistake to compare it to standard econometric metrics, because life satisfaction is limited on a scale 0 to 10.
Yeah.
Measures of GDP are not limited; they can go up indefinitely. So I find it. I find it the ultimate thing that we care about, but not very useful for policy purposes.
Yeah. So here is a quite general question. I'm going to ask it, and you see how much you can say. Statistical agencies and international organizations around the world have been using GDP for a long time to measure their economies and compare themselves to other countries in a standardized way. What would it take, and how costly would it be to shift to another measure? Challenging question.
Yes, and of course it's costly, because there are many decades of investment behind the national accounts that we have at the moment. And so I hesitate to say we should throw all of that away. I do think there are interesting ways of measuring time use, both at work and in the household. And that's a good accounting framework, because there are only 24 hours in a day and we have to use them all. We could use perhaps novel methods of collecting that data rather than the standard diary method. That, I think, is entirely feasible. The comprehensive wealth, that's a big agenda. And so there, I think the challenge is picking out important areas of focus that inform policymakers, with the downside that then becomes, I think, less comparable across countries. And so you might gain more insight into what's happening in a particular economy, but less comparability across countries. But it took decades to get the national accounts into the shape they are now. And if this is a decades-long agenda, I think that's fine.
Yeah. Okay. So another question. I hear from your presentation that GDP was never meant to measure welfare, and that it does not capture accurately wealth inequality, decent work, unpaid care work, social cohesion, etc. It seems improbable that in today's AI world, we seem unable to find ways to design new measurement systems that do focus on decent work and social outcomes. So the question is, are you implying that governments actually do not want to measure these essential social parameters? If so, without any political will, is it even useful to push for reform for better measurement? In your view, what is the real issue at stake, and where shall we start?
I find it odd that governments aren't paying more attention to measuring what's happening in their economy. I think it's often just a lack of understanding what the both advantages and limitations of existing statistics are. But when private companies are putting a lot of effort into gathering data, because they understand that data drives information and the ability to create more value for their customers and for the businesses to thrive, that governments don't see the same point. And the possibilities of data collection are now so much greater than they have been because of the technology itself. And so there's a real opportunity to make that work for governments to implement policies and for public good. And so, I think it's a real shame that, if anything, we're seeing agencies having their budgets cut rather than increased at the moment.
Yeah. I'm just looking through the questions. Give me just 1 second. There's a long question here. So is the challenge not only to count what really matters, but to rethink the locus and scale at which progress is defined in the first place? Are we expanding indicators within the same macro objective, or are we redefining the objective and measurement space altogether? A bit of a complicated question.
It is complicated. So this may be an indirect way of answering, but there's a lot of interest at local level in using a wider framework to measure people's lives locally. So we find it with local government in the UK or devolved governments, and I think that's true in other countries also. So it may be that the scale at which one is thinking is changing, or at least there's an opportunity to think differently at different scales of aggregation. So, you know, we range from global issues such as biodiversity or global supply chains, all the way down to very distinctive local issues that will vary quite a lot from place to place.
Yeah. Okay. So here was a question on financing, Diane. For countries in the global south, one of the most significant structural problems is the cost of servicing external debt, which prevents them from increasing social spending on health and education, the education that would be needed, you know, to training that would be needed to be able to benefit from digital transformations. Is it possible to renegotiate the financial burden with institutional investors? The impact would be substantial enough to improve the well-being of these populations.
Well, I'm not sure I'm qualified to answer that question. I mean, we've had episodes of renegotiation before, so there's no reason in principle it's not possible. I think the question is then, what's the incentive for that renegotiation to happen? And
yes,
we're in a very uncertain global context at the moment, obviously.
Definitely. I am wondering if it would be possible to, we have like 10 minutes left, to let some people ask their questions directly, because they would do a better job than I do. There's a lot of people, but if people raise their hands, I think we can do this.
Sure.
But before we do, I'm being told, Diane, that it's your birthday.
It was yesterday, actually.
It was yesterday, so
Yeah.
happy birthday.
Thank you.
Happy birthday. So why don't we move to letting 2, maybe 3 people ask questions directly, and if people would raise their hands.
Mhm.
And I don't know if they can see the hands.
I'm just trying to find them.
Yes.
I can't see the hands.
You can?
No, I can't see people's hands.
Maybe there are no hands.
Oh, I've just seen one. So Robert Johnston.
Robert. Hi, Robert. You can unmute yourself. Robert Johnston, the floor is yours if you want to unmute yourself.
Here we go.
Robert, we can't hear you. No. Unfortunately, we can't hear you, Robert. We'll have to move on. Okay, so do we have more hands raised? Otherwise, there's still a few questions in the chat, but if anyone wants to ask a question directly. Okay, Diane. So I'm going to use the time. So there's still a few questions in the chat.
Okay.
Hold on, let me go up again. 1 second. So adjusting the labor force for new required skills can take a long time, especially for those who are halfway in their careers already. In the meantime, what kind of policies could be envisioned? Taxing capital to finance the basic income, or we talked about the universal basic income already, or something, or some kind of living wage.
I'm a believer in the fact that people often find intrinsic value in work, And so I'm much more interested in policies that enable people to switch between jobs quickly, or to create new businesses that create new kinds of jobs. And that points you towards thinking about a benefits system that's sufficiently generous that it allows people the time to do that, which may be 6 months to a year, so it could be quite a long time. And also making sure that the skills training system is sufficiently flexible and high enough quality that people can develop the new skills that they need. So obviously one can't be unrealistic about this. People who've had manual, non-cognitive jobs can't become software systems developers. That's just on the whole unrealistic. But I don't think that the shift in the kinds of jobs available will be fast enough that many people won't be able to make those kinds of transitions.
Yes, and of course there have to be enough jobs for people to be able to use their skills, even with training.
Yes, indeed. So the aggregate demand in the economy still matters.
Exactly. Okay, any more questions live? Jonathan?
Yeah, thank you, Diane, and thank you for joining us. Just had a question on you mentioned about the importance, or the likely increasing importance, of progressive taxation on income. And obviously at the UN, we're starting to work on that, but there is obviously the issue of international competition in terms of taxes on income. So I was wondering if you, in a context where also capital is increasingly more mobile, including the technologies are mobile as well, if you had a thought for this kind of increasing taxation in a moment when things are more mobile.
When we had very high marginal tax rates in the 1960s and 70s, the kinds of people who paid those taxes didn't move very much. They would probably move a bit more now, and so there could well be some international competition. But I'm always very struck by one of Milton Friedman's essays. I think it's in his book on positive economics, where he talks about why income inequality doesn't matter, because it can reflect innate talent or particular market structures. But at the end of the essay, he says you can get to a point where inequality tears the social fabric and has gone too far. And I think some societies are in that place at the moment. We see all kinds of political protests and polarization that I think reflect the very, very unequal chances that people understand face them in their economies. So I think the politics will shift anyway. And if there is some competition for high earners to move between economies, I don't think it'll be very large scale.
Thank you.
Maybe I'm too optimistic.
Yeah, thank you.
Diane, I wanted to ask you a question, and I'm mindful of the fact that we only have 5 minutes left, but that you mentioned that the fears of a jobless future may be overblown for now, based on what we know. But there's also issues related to the quality of work, right? And
Yes.
the fact that work should be decent, and whether digitalization will make, and AI will make the work more fragmented and more monitored and more uncertain as well. And that can have important implications for the social contract, even if the future is not jobless. And there's also the fact of what I mentioned earlier, that if time savings result in lower wages for the majority of workers, that's an issue as well. So any views on all this?
Well, that's the kind of distributional and quality aspect that labour market institutions have always mediated. And in previous episodes, if you think about the early 1960s, for example, when there was a lot of automation in manufacturing, that did not lead to large-scale job losses and income inequality because the labour market institutions that prevailed at the time. So for me, it becomes a question of what's the social license to operate for large companies? If they are platforms that are making things worse for their workers and also making things progressively worse for their customers as well because they're extracting so much value, there comes a point when they lose that social license. And this takes us into political territory and not economic measurement at all. But that, you can stretch that too far. And if we end up in a world of where most people's jobs are so low quality or badly paid, that's not a stable world.
Maybe we should finish with this statement, this powerful closing statement, because yes, I think there's a few questions in the chat, but we are reaching the end of the hour, and Diane, I want to thank you very much for your time and for the presentation. We've had more than 100 participants. There were 107 participants, or 110 at some point. So lots of attention. Thanks so much. And thank you everyone for attending and for your questions.
Yes, thank you for the great questions.
Okay, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, Diane.
Bye.